Hello, my name is Arik Korman, Communications Director with League of Education Voters. Welcome to our free online webinar series, Lunchtime LEVinars. We started this series over 4 years ago to share information and build knowledge on important and timely issues. Today we will hear from Joshua Lynch, Program Supervisor, Student Discipline, Behavior, and Readiness to Learn in the Learning Assistance Program at the Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction, OSPI, and Calandra Sechrist, Director of Equity and Civil Rights at OSPI, on updates regarding student discipline and implementation of House Bill 1541, also known as the Opportunity Gap Bill, and how you can get involved. Joshua and Calandra will speak for about 20 minutes, and we'll have about 10 minutes for questions. A couple of housekeeping items before we begin. You'll notice a Q&A function on your screen. This is a space for you to pose questions to us. As always, feel free to send any feedback about the webinar quality to us at info@educationvoters.org. Joshua Lynch has served as Program Supervisor, Student Discipline, Behavior, and Readiness to Learn in the Learning Assistance Program at OSPI for the past year and a half. At OSPI, Joshua provides technical assistance and training on student discipline to educators in Washington Public Schools, and oversees agency work on the state menu of best practices and strategies for behavior. Prior to joining OSPI, Joshua provided academic and non-academic services to students in a number of school settings and received a Master of Public Administration degree with a concentration in tribal governance from the Evergreen State College. Calandra Sechrist has served as Director of Equity and Civil Rights at OSPI since January 2010. At OSPI, Calandra oversees the monitoring of state and federal civil rights laws in all Washington public schools and works with parents, students, and schools to resolve allegations of discrimination. Prior to joining OSPI, Calandra received her law degree from the University of Washington and provided legal services to homeless youth and children in foster care. Please welcome Joshua Lynch and Calandra Sechrist.
Thank you, Arik. This is Joshua Lynch, and I'm joined by Callie.
Hello.
So we're going to get started because we do have a lot to go through in very little time. So we want to start by just giving you an overview of the topics we're going to cover on the next slide as we present the student discipline updates. We'll start off by talking about student discipline rulemaking and providing you the most recent information on that process. We'll give you updates on the behavior menu of best practices, OSPI's most recent discipline data, student discipline training that's in the process of being developed, and information about ESSA and student discipline. And every one of these topics will be providing you information about where to go to find more information on these topics. So on the first point, student discipline rulemaking, we just wanted to provide first some background on the two major pieces of legislation in the last few years that have influenced changes at the state level in student discipline and behavior. The first bill here was passed in 2013 and made significant changes to laws regarding student discipline as well as laws governing the Learning Assistance Program, including directing OSPI to develop the menu of best practices for behavior. The second piece of legislation on the next slide was the bill that passed with the 2016 legislature, and this was based on recommendations from the Educational Opportunity Gap Oversight and Accountability Committee. Part one of this bill, titled Disproportionality in Student Discipline, made significant changes listed on the slide you see there. OSPI has released a couple bulletins regarding this bill soon after it passed, and those are still available on the student discipline webpage. And part of the reason OSPI is doing rulemaking is in response to this bill. So on the next slide, we'll give you some information about the student discipline rulemaking that OSPI engaged in following the passage of House Bill 1541.
All right, so in the last year, Effective September 1st of 2016, OSPI engaged in what we call expedited rulemaking, which essentially all that did was it aligned our student discipline rules with the requirements in House Bill 1541. We wanted to make sure that nothing in our current rules were inconsistent with the language in that bill. But we knew in going through that process that we wanted to take more time to do a comprehensive rewrite of the student discipline rules so that we could provide more guidance to schools and to families about what these changes actually mean and how school districts can implement them. So the expedited rules went into effect last fall. At the same time, OSPI also went through rulemaking to update these rules regarding student enrollment to make sure that students who have been suspended or expelled can be counted for enrollment so long as educational services are being provided.
And with the second phase in rulemaking, OSPI engaged in substantial rewrite of the chapter governing student discipline and OSPI rules. The purpose for phase 2 was to provide clarity and readability of the rules for districts and families, recognizing that a lot of the language in this chapter was originally written in the 1970s and was in need of being updated into more accessible, readable language. The other purpose was to clarify certain requirements that became effective in 2016 with the passage of House Bill 1541, including the requirement to provide educational services during any suspension or expulsion. Another goal in rewriting the rules was to increase opportunities for families to participate in the development of discipline policies and resolving discipline-related issues, consistent with new language in House Bill 1541, as well as existing requirements under state law regarding family engagement. We also undertook to incorporate significant feedback from internal and external groups that OSPI solicited feedback from over the past year, including reconvening the Student Discipline Task Force that was originally established with the passage of ESSB 5946 in 2013. So that task force was reconvened between October and January, and the task force members provided significant feedback on parts of the language in 1541 as we looked forward to rulemaking. So where we are currently in the next slide is OSPI just recently released proposed rules for updating the chapter on student discipline. The public comment period is officially open now and will be open until November 13, 2017 at approximately 5 p.m. The two main ways to submit comment is through written comment at the email address there, as well as written comment can be mailed to OSPI. And then there will be 4 public hearings throughout the state for people to come in person and provide comment orally. Detailed information about both of those processes can be found on the Student Discipline Proposed Rules webpage, and the link is there for your information. We're going to move on to the next topic now, which is the discipline data for the 2015-16 school year that OSPI just recently released in August. OSPI is required to release discipline data by the bill I just mentioned earlier that passed in 2013, 5946, and make that publicly available on their website. So OSPI has been doing so for the last several years. The data for this latest set shows that 3.7% of all students in Washington were suspended or expelled during the 2015-16 school year. And a new feature in how the data is displayed through OSPI's analytics breaks it out by overall out-of-school exclusions and then short-term, long-term, and expulsions. So we're seeing a downward trend in the overall use of out-of-school exclusions, but the primary areas where we're seeing the decreases in the use of long-term suspensions and expulsions. That's good news. However, racial disparities and disparities by other student groups continue to be observed in state-level data and by district data and looking closer. And the next slide shows the state level data by race for the 2015-16 school year. For more information on the discipline data analytics, as well as to view the webinar that OSPI did when that data was released, you can follow the link below, and resources there can be available, as well as information about when the next sets of data for OSPI performance indicators, including discipline, will be released. Moving on to the next topic, OSPI's behavior menu of best practices and strategies, which was originally created with the 2013 legislation I mentioned earlier, was updated and published on OSPI's website in May this year. OSPI was directed to develop the menus of best practices for ELA, math, and behavior with the Washington State Institute for Public Policy, as well as with a panel of experts and practitioners convened by OSPI, and is required by the legislature to update these menus annually by July 1st. The deadline was moved back this year because we wanted to ensure that the menus and the resources were available to districts in a timely manner to be planning for programs and services to be offered in the following school year. And we intend to keep with having a deadline that is well before the July 1st deadline established by the legislature. Districts implementing learning assistance program services must be looking to the menus and best practices for implementing their lab programs. And under Washington's new ESSA plan, schools identified for improvement will be required to be looking to the menus as well. For more information, you can follow the link there. And I highly recommend looking at all three menus as we focus on improving outcomes academically and non-academically for all students. Information about the organization of the menu on the next slide. You'll find in all three menus. So general welcome background regarding how the menus came about, information about the Learning Assistance Program and the Washington State Institute for Public Policy. We also have information about the Integrated Student Supports Protocol that is currently being developed in response to Part 8 of House Bill 1541, which ties nicely into the section that we have on multi-tiered system of supports. And the MTSS work group is continuing to align messaging, and we look to updating that messaging in our menus every year when we come around to updating them. The behavior menu, as well as the other menus, contain a content philosophy section, which outlines the overall themes for behavior, ELA, or math, and then the menu entries themselves. And then each menu has a section on implementation, and there's a heavy focus on all of the menus in implementation and how practices, as far as being implemented to see improvement in student outcomes, can be done well. On the next slide is just a quick look at what types of practices are contained in the behavior menu itself. You'll see a couple with 2 stars there that were significantly updated in the last version of the menu, as well as a new entry from the ELA menu, kindergarten transitions, was included in the behavior menu in this last update. Moving on to the next topic, OSPI has been working on developing discipline training, and this was required under House Bill 1541. And statute, the purpose is to support implementation of discipline policies and procedures under Washington state law. And the audience is any and all staff who work in and have contact with students, whether in the school or district. The training modules are going to be developed and released in phases during this 2017-18 school year. And the format, once they are formalized and available online, will allow both in-person use and delivery, as well as online delivery of the content. On the next slide, you'll see the conceptual framework we've been working with in developing the content, aligning what educators should know about Washington state laws with what best practices and research says about discipline and behavior. And connecting the dots between policy and practice. So the first module, which we'll be doing a webinar on October 11th, and information from OSPI will be forthcoming in the next week about that, so that you can hold that on your schedule. We'll provide a foundation for understanding best practices in discipline and discipline laws. And then subsequent modules will provide more detailed information regarding the use of data as required under Washington state law, due process, and other discipline procedures. The reason we're holding off on some of the more details is we want the modules, once they're available, to be consistent with the new rules that we hope will be adopted later this year. And rather than creating discipline training consistent with the current language in the Washington Administrative Code, we thought it best to have that consistent with the new rules and available upon release of those rules, so that we didn't have to confuse everybody and revise it in the process. Moving on to the last topic, ESSA, and this is new language included in the ESSA, requires state and district plans to include how they're going to reduce the overuse of discipline practices that remove students from the classroom. So something new in Title I on the next slide related to this new language in ESSA is that when districts are submitting their annual plan, there is a new checklist related to student discipline that asks for information regarding the district point of contact person, including assurances regarding how the district is complying with implementation of current state laws, including the ones I just mentioned earlier, and then identifying how the district and the schools are reviewing types of discipline actions and using that data to inform their approaches to prevent or address behavior, as well as to reduce the use of exclusionary discipline and reduce disparities and disproportionality in discipline. Districts are also required under this checklist to indicate what type of professional learning and multi-tiered system of supports that integrates behavior is being used within the district. So that's all of the topics that we had to cover in this brief amount of time as far as student discipline updates go. I think we've left enough time here for some question and answers, and depending on the question, Callie or I can speak to the answer given our content areas.
All right, well, thank you very much, Joshua and Callie. We really appreciate it. We have about 10 minutes for questions. And so if you would like to ask a question, please type your question in the Q&A section on your screen, and no question is too basic. I've got one already to start, which is, are districts or school buildings setting up systems to detect student issues as soon as possible and find solutions that do not result in disciplinary action?
I certainly know that districts are required to be doing prevention and setting up systems to address discipline and behavior. We know that some districts do that well, and others are still in the process of learning how to do that as far as what works for their specific contexts and the needs of their students to address those areas.
Yep, absolutely. And we're definitely aware of school districts who are implementing those kinds of systems of support for students and have early warning systems where they can identify issues before they turn into behavior incidents. But if you are in a district that you are interested in sharing your perspective with us, we're always looking for more examples of school districts who are implementing evidence-based or best practices so that we can share that with other school districts and communities. So if you're aware of a school district that has a great practice, please feel free to let us know.
Great, and what are some of the early warnings that seem to be most effective?
Again, broadly thinking about the idea that academics and non-academics factor into student outcomes. Within the Learning Assistance Program, and you see this messaging emphasized in the menus, is early warning indicators can not just be exclusive to looking at discipline incidents. It ties into attendance, it ties into grades and performance within the academic setting. So early warning indicators really should include all of the above, and as more information is known about a specific student, you'd want to hone in and track what indicator stands out most for identifying the needs of those students or student.
Great, thank you. We have a question here. Is it going to be optional for all staff and teachers to take the discipline training you mentioned? And if so, what happens if individuals do not?
So the statutory language that established the discipline training that OSPI was directed to develop strongly encourages district and schools to be delivering the training. OSPI is communicating with principals and other school leaders around the training so that we can hopefully support them in delivering that training. We'd like to think that it's delivered more in person than online. So establishing those networks, because we know that in best practice, real learning occurs when you have shared learning in teams, and that's ongoing and consistent. So what happens if they don't take the training? As far as compliance goes, nothing, because there is no compliance mechanism for taking the training, if that's the question.
Yeah, but we absolutely, you know, as Josh mentioned, we certainly encourage schools to make sure that it's accessible to their staff, but it's not a requirement at this point.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Another question here is there anything in the works to collect more detailed behavior codes from districts? OSPI currently has about 20 codes, while some districts have over 70 codes.
So in 2013, with the passage of that first bill I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, the Discipline Task Force's work really focused on broadening the categories that were collected at the state level for behavior, because at the time it was only the few federal categories for behavior that were collected at the state level. What you'll see if you go to the 2015-16 school year data is that the inclusion of all those extra categories at the state level has significantly reduced the reporting of behaviors that go into the category of other at the state level, yet it is still the highest reported category. And so conversations are more oriented towards looking at longitudinally what's going to happen with that other category. We don't necessarily expect to see the shift to occur all at once through one school year. So any conversations about adding new categories are not at the urgent point at this point at the state level. The task force, when they did their initial work, really tried to capture the most used behavior types that all the other categories of behaviors that districts and schools use for reporting could be funneled into up at the state level. For any feedback on that, I would recommend talking to data governance or someone within student information at OSPI and offering input.
Great, thank you. I have a question here, which is, what is the total number of days a student can be suspended or expelled in a school year? And is there a difference between students who are in regular education versus special education?
So all student discipline laws in Washington, the general laws in student discipline, apply across the board, whether the student is identified for special education or not. In the current rules, there are differences between how long students can be suspended or expelled by exclusion type, as well as there are limitations in the rules on the cumulative number of days that a student in grades K through 4 or 5 through 12 can receive short-term suspensions within any semester or trimester. With the proposed rules, those limitations still apply. we've tried to clarify some of that language in the rules, but with passage of House Bill 1541, the limitation on the maximum time that a student could be suspended long-term or expulsion was reduced to the length of an academic term. There still exists in statute and in the rules an exception for public health safety reasons that a principal can petition a district superintendent to exceed that length. And so that rule is in place because of a statute. And then there's also federal law which requires a district to expel a student for no less than 1 year initially for firearms violations, which then can subsequently be modified on a case-by-case basis.
So,
Callie, you want to add?
Yeah, so one note about students in special education and students who are eligible under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. If a student with a disability under either of those two laws is suspended or expelled for 10 consecutive days or 10 or more cumulative days within a school year, if it constitutes a pattern of removal, and we could spend a whole another hour just talking about what that means. But essentially, there's a roughly 10-day rule by which that becomes what is called a change in placement under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or under Section 504. What that means is that at that point, the school district must conduct what's called a manifestation determination to determine whether or not the behavior was substantially related to the student's disability or failure to comply or meet the student's needs under an IEP or a Section 504 plan. And then depending on the results of that manifestation determination, the student can either continue to be suspended or expelled or not. So it doesn't necessarily place a limit on the number of days a student with a disability can be suspended or expelled, but it does trigger additional procedures that a school district has to follow that then will trigger whether or not the student can still be removed from the school. So there are special protections for students with disabilities, and we have more information on our website if you want more details on that.
Great, well, thank you very much. And once again, if you have a question, you can type that in the Q&A section on your screen. I have another one here. How will OSPI ensure that students receive educational services when they are suspended or expelled? What kinds of resources will be available to districts from the state to help them serve students?
That's a very good question, and it's something that we are interested in learning more about how we can support school districts. In the proposed student discipline rules, we do outline some criteria by which we are proposing that school districts provide those educational services depending on the length that a student is being removed for. As far as exactly what those services look like, districts can, they have the flexibility to provide those services within the confines of the rules in the way that makes most sense for the district. So that could include anything from providing online instruction through an online program or other kinds of services. And some of those are outlined in the proposed rules. So I definitely encourage folks to take a look at that. As far as any kind of enforcement mechanism, I think that might have been part of the question. OSPI currently does not have any legislative authority to enforce the student discipline rules. We have authority to adopt the rules, but as far as compliance, there is not authority to enforce compliance with the rules. That would be something that students and advocates can work through the legal system for.
Great, thank you. What is happening in the elementary arena, especially in the primary grades? I know that there are some measures so that kindergartners won't be expelled, but what is the trend?
So in the last legislative session, there was a bill that was put forward that would have prohibited suspension, expulsion of students in kindergarten through 2nd grade, and OSPI wrote a bill analysis, and in part of that bill analysis was looking at some of the trends in the data. In the current rules, districts are already prohibited from using long-term suspension for students in kindergarten through 4th grade. So when we look at the data, very, very few students within the kindergarten grade span received an expulsion. I can't remember off the top of my head what the number was, but it was very, very minuscule. So the trend that we're seeing in other states, as well as in Washington, really is a focus on limiting exclusion specifically early on because of the impact it can have later down the line for students and their academic and non-academic outcomes. I don't know if that fully answers the question, but
yeah, that's a start. Thank you very much. We got time for about 2 more questions. We have, do all the federal laws, such as the IDEA, for example, supersede the Washington state laws and codes?
So I'm not aware of a place where the IDEA is currently in conflict with our state law. School districts are required to follow both our state law and federal law, including the IDEA. And if there were any conflict between the laws, it would depend on I guess in which direction which law is conflicting with which. State law can be more restrictive and provide more requirements than federal law. So in those cases, school districts are required to follow both.
Great, thank you. And last question. Our current codes state that teachers must use 1 or more forms of discipline to support students in meeting behavioral expectations. Why not replace the word discipline with engagement? In its current format, this area sets a confrontational mode between the teacher and the student and assumes that only the student needs a behavioral change and ignores that the teacher should try changing her or his behavior or engagement strategy with the student.
If whoever asked that question or proposed that idea would like, now would be the perfect time to submit comment on the proposed rules for adjusting any language like that. And that would be the appropriate place to submit that comment, because OSPI is required at the end of the rulemaking process to respond to each comment received during this public comment period in a concise explanatory statement.
Great. Well, that certainly leads into the next steps, which is submitting comments during the public comment period. Thank you for a great presentation, Josh and Callie. Our next webinar on how Washington compares with model states like Massachusetts will take place next month, with the exact date to be determined. Registration information will soon be on our website, educationvoters.org. Thanks to each of you for joining us today. If you have additional questions, please send them to info@educationvoters.org. A recording of today's presentation will be available on our website, educationvoters.org, along with the slide deck from today, so that way you can follow up with how to submit comments during the public comment period and to see some of the resources that Josh and Callie shared today. Please feel free to share all of this with your friends and colleagues. And thank you again for attending. We hope you will join us at future webinars.